Dr. Brooks is familiar with that objective. She led a movement in the 90s, resulting in the first ever sex workers union at a strip club in San Francisco. So welcome to the program, Dr. Brooks. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
And we should also mention you're chairman of the Department of African American Studies at Fullerton.
So, I am.
So,
I'm very busy.
We've got a lot going on, right? Now, tell me why did your union effort succeed in San Francisco, but it's not been replicated, I don't think, anywhere else since then?
Excellent question. So when I was a college student at San Francisco State, I was a women's studies major, and sort of backstory, I heard from a lot of colleagues that they were having financial problems, and someone said, you know what you should do? You should audition at the Lusty Lady. And at that time, the Lusty Lady was a women-ran peep show in North Beach in San Francisco, and it had a reputation as a feminist club for that reason. So I auditioned. At this time, there was a show director, that's what we call the managers, a Black woman who hired me. And I was elated, it was exciting. This was a time where there was a lot of experimentation going on with like the arts and sexuality in San Francisco. And one of the key features that made the Lusty Lady unique was that we were employees, whereas most dancers are not employees. Legally, they are classified, and some would argue misclassified, as independent contractors. And so because we were already employees, we had a paycheck, we had taxes taken out of, that we got paid every 2 weeks, we were in the legal position to be successful in the unionization effort.
So tell me about which union did you join and what rights did you get for your workers?
We joined SEIU Local 790, and the rights that we got were elimination of racial discrimination in terms of shifts. So for instance, when I started working there were about 70 dancers and only 3 were Black. And then out of that 3, we had 1 dark-skinned Black woman and the other 2 were fair complexion. And so there was a lot of, and I was very surprised at this because of the reputation of it being a feminist strip club and being kind of cutting edge and ahead of its time. In that sense, I was surprised at the overt racial discrimination that occurred in hiring and then also in scheduling, right? So that was one issue. The other issue connected to race was it was a peep show, but you also had a feature of the club called a private pleasures booth. And sometimes this is known as a champagne room in some clubs. Sometimes it's known as a VIP room. But basically, this is an opportunity for dancers to make more money, right? And so, as I mentioned, we got a paycheck and you were paid like, maybe $11 an hour, and it went up based on how long you were there. But really, the real money came from performing in what was called the booth. And that was where a customer could come in and it was $5 for 3 minutes. And of course, sometimes they would put in $100 bill or $20 bills. And so that was really where you would make your money and it would show up in your next paycheck. Well, Black dancers were told specifically that we could not work there. And the reason why we couldn't work there was the argument was that white customers didn't want to see Black women there, but but they did want to see Black women on stage. So peep show, right?
Why the difference? Why the difference?
Because it only took a quarter to operate the window, because it's a peep show, so you're separated by glass. Technically, it only took a quarter to get that going, whereas it took at least $5 to have a show in booth. So we were told in very explicit terms that Black women made the club lose money, even though there was no research on this. They didn't do any marketing surveys, if you will, any sort of like customer feedback. They just said, oh, well, this isn't good. The other thing in terms of what led to the unionization was this was again 1995, 1996. The internet is like still in its young terms. For listeners that cannot imagine a time yet pre-internet, where we still had VCRs, and so people were coming in with video cameras, and at the club there were like 3 windows or rooms where if a customer wanted to be discreet, they could go in and they could see you, but you couldn't see them. And so people were videotaping certain dancers, and because the internet was new, we were concerned, where is this going to go? Is this going to go into like some like underground porn? Is this going to be on the internet? The internet is new, we don't know what that means in terms of reputation, safety, other jobs. And so for the longest, the club refused to remove those windows because they argued that that was a clientele population that they wanted to serve. And so after meeting with management, before we unionized, they made concessions in terms of like the Black dancers. They did remove one of the one-way windows, but we knew we needed permanent protection from a union. And so we worked with an organization called the Exotic Dancers Alliance, and they worked largely with the other clubs that were not eligible to unionize, the clubs where people were independent contractors, lap dancers. There is no separation in terms of glass between the dancer and the customer, right? They led us to a union rep, Stephanie Beatty, was wonderful. And she took our case. And so it was about a little over 6 months of first getting the vote from the workers that they wanted to unionize, getting approval from the National Labor Relations Board, and we opt to unionize with SEIU Local 790, and then we became the first successful strip club to do so. There was a club in San Diego called Pacers that had technically unionized before, but they weren't successful.
This is an old saw at this point, but I do want to ask the question that really divides feminists on this issue, which is why not advocate for more education, more, you obviously got an advanced education and became chair of a department at a major university. But most of those women, I imagine, did not have anything like those kinds of options. And so feminists starting back in the 80s and 90s, some would say, well, this work is demeaning to women and we don't want to support unionizing them. We want to give them opportunities to get out of that kind of work. What do you say about that?
Definitely those feminist debates were in full swing, as you could imagine, in the early 90s when I was in college, and then obviously before. So I have various thoughts on that. I think, as I mentioned, I was a women's studies major. That's what we used to call gender studies back in the day. And I've been very exposed to all those debates about, it's exploitative, this is what the feminist movement of the 70s sort of fought against, right? And then there was another framework operating about choice, and it was very much, I could do whatever I want with my body. These are my rights. If I want to make money like this, I should be able to do so. But one of the things that have always been missing from those debates is the category of race. And that's where my work came in, because whether you're for sex work or against sex work, being a woman of color in this industry complicates both of those debates, in the sense of, I used to joke with my colleagues, and when people would talk about the objectification, I'm like, well, you know what if you're not good enough to be objectified?
Why do you think being a woman of color changes the mindset of the feminist movement?
What if you can't even get hired in these clubs to begin with, to even get upset about being objectified? Because that was one of the things that I was surprised at, the level of racism, the level of segregation, the level of stratification of the quote unquote gentlemen's clubs, being extremely hard to break into versus the street clubs. So I guess to your question, I would say that that's a stereotype. First of all, that women who are in the exotic dance industry are sort of desperate, or they're undereducated, or they're on drugs, or whatever. I mean, of course, those features can be there, but those features can be present in many other jobs as well. So I think part of what we make the argument for is all people need safe working conditions, whether you work at a strip club, whether you work for Amazon, whether you work for UPS, longshoremen, whatever it is, we all need safe working conditions. And also race complicates that feminist debate.
You did a study back in when, the 80s, the 90s, about discrimination against women of color in the sex industry. There obviously is discrimination in every industry, but especially you would say in the sex work industry. But a lot of this is based on, I suppose, what the clients want.
In 2010, I published a book that was based on my dissertation from SUNY Press called Unequal Desires, Race and Erotic Capital in the Stripping Industry. And what I did was I made the sociological argument, since that's my training as a sociologist, that one of the ways in which racial stratification functions is through sexuality. And that's something that we don't look at, right? And so surprising observations that I found were similar to, say, housing discrimination, where I think a lot of us are at this point anyway familiar with the way housing is very racially segregated. In California, we can see that. New York, back east, any city, you can see that most Black areas are underfunded, over-policed, disinvested in, versus predominantly white suburban areas. Tax bases are different, educational systems are different. And so strip clubs are a mirror of that larger apparatus of racial, segregation. So most Black dancers I found worked in strip clubs that would be considered unsafe for different reasons. Over policing, not having proper security at a club, being located in areas where the street lamps don't quite work, where, you have to walk quite a distance to get to a subway if you're taking public transportation home, right? Food deserts, right? So basically, the strip clubs in the book that I looked at were one in the Bronx, which definitely had a lot of those things that I just mentioned. And then I contrast that to a gentleman's club in Manhattan that was predominantly white, that was in like an area where there's like a lot of hustle and bustle, there's businesses, there's like well-lit street lights, there's taxi cabs and subways, and there's a lot of activity that makes you feel like you're in an area that's more invested in, right? And that's given the zoning laws, right? Which Giuliani, when he was mayor of New York, had put in place, where, you couldn't operate a strip club within so many feet of like a school or something else, right? So even with that feature, it still felt like it was in an area that was more invested in than the one in the Bronx. So that was one thing that I thought was very interesting. The other thing was that dancers of color who worked in places like the Bronx, they were sometimes not scheduled at desirable times. Even there was colorism. Lighter skinned women are at the shifts where, the lunchtime shift where it's more people. Even in lesbian clubs, which was the third club I studied in my book, those things also were present. And so to your question, I get that a lot, like, well, what can you do about it if this is what the client wants, right? Well, part of why we think the client wants something is because that's all that's provided, right? So a lot of this with taste studies, I call the desire industries in my book. Part of how that functions is, well, if you're not giving people an opportunity to choose or an array of different looks, then of course it's going to appear as if they only want the mainstream, sort of like thin or, blonde archetype, when that's not necessarily true. The other thing is, well, if these women were not going to be desirable, why were they hired in the first place at the club?
You would assume that a lot of these decisions are business-based decisions. So maybe the operators of these clubs are absolutely wrong, but I guess they're thinking that more clients want white strippers, want to come see white strippers than strippers of color. And So
Right.
if
Well,
they feature more women of color, business isn't as good. I don't know. I'm just trying to
right. Well, but then
figure
I think
out why
right, right, right. I think that's the assumption because again, it's part of like in any other job, we would do taste analysis. We would do, some sort of like, oh, okay, well, let's see if we have this particular archetype here. Let's test it, right? Like that usually happens, but that doesn't happen actually in this industry. It's a lot of sort of we're just going to assume we want the best, buck for our bank, so to speak. So we're just going to assume that we're going to break even with, someone that looks more mainstream, then take a chance on someone who doesn't, right? But there's not any basis for that. So, for instance, with the union at the Lusty Lady, we were able to get an increase in dark skin black dancers with natural hair. And true, maybe not all the customers wanted to see them. However, they did have a following, right? They were able to have a following. They did have people who came and were like, oh, is blah 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 working today? What shift is she on, right? Whereas that would not have happened had the union not had to step in to say, hey, you need to open the doors more for diversity.
And what happens when they do open? Do you have proof that business booms when that happens, or increases at all?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting observation. So yes, there are ways to prove that, right? In terms of businesses, I think with the Lusty Lady, because as we know, it closed in like the early 2000s just because the rent went up. And what was interesting is that they were a co-op for a while, and I know that there were challenges there with trying to be a co-op. You go from union to co-op because you're trying to keep the business open, right? And also trying to stay true to the spirit of the Lusty Lady with like diverse hires, right? And so I think that business can boom. And I also think that sometimes there's just economic downturns that even under your best efforts to keep a business open, it, there's too much against it, right? The internet changed a lot. So as I was mentioning, when I worked there, it was before the internet. So people kind of wanted to still see people in person in a peep show, kind of like old school setting. But by the time, the Lusty closed, the internet was in full swing and it was hard to compete with that.
Nevada is the only state in the country where prostitution is legal, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So it is everything that is being done at these clubs legal or illegal?
That's a good kind of way to segue to why we need unions and strip clubs to begin with. So I would say fine line, right? I would with strip clubs. So it's interesting that you brought up the Nevada example of legalized prostitution. So yeah, that's been going on for some time, and that means that you have to have certain protocols, STD testing, things that make that legal, right? Well, in strip
Are
clubs,
there any state imposed diversity requirements?
you have to look and see at these various places if that's something that they're invested in, right? Because we know just because prostitution is legal, that doesn't mean that other things sort of are in the floodgate with progression, right? But I think what I was going to say, which you reminded me of, there is a blur sometimes in strip clubs and prostitution. So at most strip clubs, not the Lusty, but at other strip clubs where you're not an employee, a lot of women have to do tip outs called stage fees. So that means that you go on your stage and you do your set, right? Like about 3 or 4 songs to kind of advertise yourself, right? And then you lap dance, and that's usually how dancers make their money. But what a lot of people don't know is you don't get to keep all of those tips, right? So at some clubs, for instance, you might have a stage fee that you're required to pay at the end, like $250, $300 out of your own pocket, right? And they justify that because they say, well, in a way, you rent the stage for the amount of time that you perform with us.
Did you know stage fees existed? Because I didn't.
And that's why you have a
So
stage.
they're making just like, for example, the the brokerage houses, each broker is told you're running an independent business, and they do set up their own corporations and they use the brand, but they're independent contractors, meaning, you know, the company doesn't pay for vacation or health coverage or any of those things. And they're really, they are independent contractors just working under the umbrella of a name. So you're saying that's exactly what's going on.
It's very
in strip
similar.
clubs.
It's very similar, but it's a lot of people have argued, but it's incorrect, because if you're really independent contractor, why would you have to be there at a certain time? Why would you be recommended if you were late? And so there are these contradictions. So because of the stage fee that's associated with that misclassification of being an independent contractor, you could imagine the stress that that would create. What if you have a slow night, right? So because you have to tip out, say, almost $300 plus, have made enough to make it worthwhile for you to come into work in the first place. So sometimes you do have situations of prostitution that happens under that guise of trying to make a stage fee. That has been an issue even when I was dancing back in the 90s, of the problem with even the term legalized prostitution, because technically one could argue that would be an example of it. It's in a strip club that's legal, but it's obviously illegal to have that activity, but it happens, right? And so that's part of why the union movement is so important in New York. There's been union efforts here in Southern California right now. There's a club, Star Garden, in North Hollywood, that just got approval to unionize, right? So it's very exciting. But those are the reasons why strippers would want to unionize.
Well, how long before unionization involves more than just being a work, you know, termed an employee, getting health care, getting paid vacation? How long before it gets to, if ever, diversity?
That's a challenge. That's a challenge, to be honest. I mean, again, using the Lusty Lady as an example. So we had a union, right? We did have an increase in diversity. However, what I had noticed from my own observations during that time, and I think this is applicable to any work environment. You know, we hear a lot about diversity training, diversity hires, right? What does it mean once we get in, though? That's the part that people don't quite know what to grapple with. So people feel like, okay, now we hire different people, but then once the different people are there, then what? So that was the issue we encountered, where we did have more Black dancers, but the climate of the club didn't change. So once they were there, they felt marginalized with other dancers, right?
So the retention rate, it's interesting because I recently interviewed a woman who wrote a book called Bully Market about how she was a partner at Goldman Sachs, and she was one of the highest paid women there, but she was treated horribly by her coworkers in a very sexist way. And she said that the answer to the problem of not enough diversity of all kinds on Wall Street is focus on retention rates. In other words, not just hiring, not just out there looking for people of color, but how many of them stay after they get there? Do you think that's something that could be applicable to strip clubs?
Yes. Oh, most definitely. If we're talking about strip clubs being in the same vein as other industries, and as you pointed out, that's a challenge. That's a challenge in the university setting, a challenge in law firms. It's just a challenge. For instance, what I had noticed at our club, eventually we lost a lot of those Black dancers that we had fought to hire. We couldn't retain all of them for the very reasons you're talking about in other industries. Didn't quite have the plan in place of, okay, now you hire people that are marginalized, but how do we keep them?
What's going on now with unionization of sex workers?
I think it's on the radar. I think that, you know, with an eye towards this club I had mentioned earlier, Star Garden in North Hollywood here in California, that's going to be the litmus test again, you know, because if they're successful, they would be the second successful club since the Lusty Lady to unionize. And then will be interesting to see how the union shifts, right, the work issues that are going on there. And hopefully that can be a wave of the future for other dancers hoping to unionize, hoping to challenge their independent status classification. I think it's exciting. I think that's definitely where we need to go. We just saw Amazon workers unionizing. That was really fascinating and successful. So I think that this is the time.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Siobhan Brooks, who is an educator, an activist, and an author, and who is advocating for unions for sex workers.
This video raises questions, and I need for you to be extremely honest in the comments when answering them. And just so you know, I have 5 questions. Number 1, should adult entertainment workers unionize? Number 2, are you for or against unions? Number 3, why do you think people go to so many adult dancing clubs? Number 4, when you're going to these type of clubs, what type of women do you prefer to see, or men? And number 5, are you for or against diversity? Now, please be honest in the comments when answering these questions. Share this video with anyone you deem necessary. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.